Well, the first thing to say about the Caucasus, it's incredibly beautiful. You've got these amazing mountain landscapes, amazing contrast of landscapes. If you fly across Karabakh in a helicopter, as I've done a couple of times, you understand why it's such a coveted bit of ground. You've got arid landscapes on either side, and then you've got this beautiful wooded highland landscape, which is Karabakh. Nagorny in Russian means mountainous, and Karabakh means black garden, and so it's a landscape of woods, of forests, of vineyards. It's a really beautiful place to visit, and it's no wonder that both Armenians and Azerbaijanis feel this very strong attachment to it. On the Armenian side, that's pretty obvious because you've also got these incredible medieval churches dotted over the landscape, some of them going back 10th, 12th century, which you find and you walk through the forests and you come across a ruin after 2 hours walk. It's really something quite impressive. So it's been a place that's been written about for more than 1,000 years, and there have been people living there for several thousand years. Well, I guess the first thing to say is I don't think we should be talking about ancient hatreds, quote unquote, between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Clearly, they're two quite different people. They have different religions, but for most of their history, they've got along fine. They've interacted. In Karabakh, you used to have intermarriage between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. They're two quite distinct peoples, but they've always traded together. And if you go to Georgia, which is the third country in the Caucasus nowadays, you still have villages which have mixed Armenian and Azerbaijani communities. You have them buying fruit and vegetables or cars off one another. So there's nothing intrinsic. There's nothing it's not a primordial hatred that goes back to the mists of time. Someone actually said this is a conflict that goes back to the mists of the 20th century. And basically, I think what we're looking at is the Soviet Union and the end of the Russian Empire. You're looking at a mixed territory where Armenians and Azerbaijanis living side by side. And this territory, which is a bit to the east of where most Armenians live, this mountain territory called Karabakh. So you have a territory called Karabakh, which has a large Armenian population, a big meaning to the Armenians, all these Armenian churches and monasteries. And it's surrounded by Azerbaijanis who live down in the plains, and they bring their sheep up to Karabakh. Many of them are shepherds. They bring their sheep up every summer to the high pastures. So at some point in history, there was probably an Armenian majority in Karabakh in the winter and an Azerbaijani majority in the summer when the shepherds came up to the pastures. So they're all mixed together. And when you have an empire controlling it, whether it be the Persian Empire or the Russian Empire or even the Soviet Empire, they live side by side more or less okay. There's a Russian policeman who you can call, who comes in and knocks heads together if there's a problem. The problem begins when the policeman isn't there, when the empires fall apart, and these two people are staring each other in the face, and it's not quite certain where this place belongs to. That was the situation in 1918 with the end of the Russian Empire, and that was the situation in the late 1980s when the Soviet Union came to fall apart. You had this majority Armenian region situated geographically inside Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijanis didn't want to let go of it, and the Armenians, for understandable reasons, wanted to break out of Azerbaijan and link up with Armenia. So it was the collision of this strong force with an immovable object. And people who'd been getting on pretty well, people who'd been neighbours for years, suddenly found themselves on different sides and ended up fighting one another. Well, I think things get going when Mikhail Gorbachev becomes leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. And let's not forget, this was actually the very first ethnic dispute in Gorbachev's Soviet Union. So this was way before the Baltic states started to split away or Georgia started to rise up. Karabakh was the very, very first. You had the first, in the Soviet Union, you had the first mass protests, you had the first industrial strikes, you had the first violence, which was in Sumgait, all happening for the first time in and around Karabakh. So what happens is the Armenians in the spirit of Gorbachev's new glasnost and perestroika, they decide that it's their moment to petition Moscow and say, we don't want to be in Azerbaijan, we want to join Soviet Armenia, and they start sending petitions and delegations to Moscow, and then they organize this little local vote in the little Karabakh parliament. Clearly someone in Armenia is giving them a bit of a nod and a wink, and possibly someone in Moscow as well. But Gorbachev doesn't want this. He doesn't want any changing of borders. And from his point of view, if you change one border in the Soviet Union, then you've got about 20 people saying they want to change their borders, including, for example, the people in Crimea who are in Ukraine. So for fairly understandable reasons, Gorbachev says, one, no changing of the borders, but two, I'm not going to lock people up. This is the new spirit of freedom, so they can protest, but we're not going to have mass arrests either. And basically what that does is it means the problem is not resolved, but it means people go on protesting, and people are getting pretty angry on both sides of the conflict. And then what then happens is that you have this little industrial town in Azerbaijan. And don't forget that Azerbaijan has a large Armenian population, more than 300,000 Armenians living there. And some people flee Armenia. They're not actually killed, but some of them are beaten up. Some of them, Azerbaijanis, flee Armenia. They arrive in this little town called Sumgait, which is a not very nice, polluted industrial town, which has a lot of criminals in. And they start saying, we were thrown out of Armenia. Now, some of this may have been exaggerated, some of it may have been true, but the local population is already quite whipped up and excited. And a demonstration breaks out in the town against the Armenians. And in this demonstration, you've got lots of thuggish criminal young men, and they start going around the town looking for Armenians. The whole thing gets out of control. The police aren't there. And this horrible violence breaks out in which you've got these gangs of young men looking for Armenians, beating them up, raping women, killing local Armenians, and no one intervenes. It takes Moscow 24 hours to send in troops to intervene. By official figures, 32 people die, 26 Armenians and 6 Azerbaijanis, and for 24 hours this little Soviet town becomes a war zone. The Soviet Union's never seen anything like it, and this becomes a kind of national incident. And as a result, the whole of Armenians, and of course Armenians have memories of violence committed by Turks in the early bit of the 20th century. This strikes a nerve in the Armenians, and tens of thousands of Armenians leave Azerbaijan, fearing that the same thing will happen to them. And so that's the whole spark. It's the kind of nuclear meltdown, from which what was a political dispute suddenly becomes a violent dispute and ends up being a full-scale conflict. In the Soviet period, 1988 to 1990, the Soviet authorities in Moscow basically didn't do much. They just let it happen. They bussed people around. Armenians living in Azerbaijan moved to Armenia. Azerbaijanis living in Armenia moved to Azerbaijan. Tens of thousands of people. And it was a pretty horrible process. And people who'd been living there for generations on both sides moved out. The Armenians of Baku had been there for centuries. Many of them had built the city. They built the oil industry, and suddenly they were being thrown out of their own city. So it was a pretty traumatic experience. So that was in the Soviet period, this mass movement of people. But levels of violence were low. Levels of displacement and trauma were pretty high. It's not until 1991, 1992, with the end of the Soviet Union and Armenia, Azerbaijan becoming independent countries, that you start to see what we might call a full-scale war between the two sides. What that means is that the Russian policeman is gone. The Soviet Union is over. Moscow is pulling out of the region. But what Moscow is leaving behind is lots and lots of weapons. There were two armies. There was the 4th Army in Azerbaijan, and there was the 7th Army in Armenia. They basically get all their weapons, including tanks and artillery, get left behind. and a lot of the personnel as well, a lot of the military personnel. You've got unemployed Russian, Ukrainian officers without a job, and um, they are guns for hire. And there are some battles in the Karabakh War, in fact, which you've got Russians fighting on both sides, not because they're supported by Moscow, but these are just military men looking for some pay and driving tanks or flying aircraft and fighting against each other on both sides. So Moscow pulls out of the region. You've got the two sides, supposedly independent countries, still fighting over this disputed bit of territory, and they've got all the weapons left behind. So no wonder it's a full-scale war. Well, you've got this mosaic of villages in Karabakh, an Armenian village here, an Azerbaijani village there, and yeah, for most of the time they'd got on, but suddenly they had to take sides. Obviously, they took sides with their nation, and they might start in the first bit by throwing stones at buses, and then they might move on to using crossbows or hunting rifles. And then with 1992 and all this weaponry, suddenly you've got tanks being involved, aircraft, artillery, maybe primitive stuff, but stuff that can kill a lot of people. The casualties start to climb into the thousands, but most people get out in time. So it's more a matter of massive displacement of refugees more than bloody massacres. There are a few particularly nasty bits of bloodshed. There's the shelling of the town of Stepanakert by the Azerbaijanis, where a lot of people are taking shelter and people are killed. And then there's a massacre in the Azerbaijani village of Khojali, where these Azerbaijani villagers are fleeing down a valley, and these rather crazed Armenian paramilitaries shoot a lot of them point blank, and several hundred people get killed. So there are these horrible incidents, but it's more a matter of trying to grab the territory rather than to kill people. And eventually the Armenians, they're better organized, they're politically more together, they have better military training, and they're also in the majority in Karabakh, and they start to get a grip and to get more territory, and they start to win the war. I think it's counterproductive because I think most people in Armenia don't think of what happened in Karabakh as genocide. I think most people in Armenia probably want to have some kind of a political solution to their problems with Azerbaijan. They want to see the borders open. They want to see Armenia become a normal developing nation which trades with the rest of the world. And so I think some of the people who come to the Karabakh conflict, talking about 1915, talking about genocide, are basically condemning Armenia to a completely black and white picture in which Azerbaijanis are genocidal. We can't make peace with them, therefore we have to live in these closed borders, therefore we can't really develop as a country. If you start to think of it more as a normal conflict in which there's a dispute over a bit of territory and we need to sort out that dispute, and hopefully from the Armenian perspective we get some kind of good status for Karabakh, then you talk about making peace, you talk about making a deal, and you don't talk about genocide. Well, I think what happens is, let me put it this way. I think what happens is that conflict reinforces people's sense of identity. You were friends with your Azerbaijani neighbor, you got along, you went to his wedding, you hung out together, you played cards. The war begins, and suddenly you notice he's an Azerbaijani. You didn't notice that before. You noticed the other guy's an Armenian. Before that, you were just friends. You just hung out together. Suddenly, this new category enters your relationship, and that's happening on the whole level of two peoples. So suddenly there's a conflict, and it's not just that something bad happened to me. It's all those Armenians are bad. All those Azerbaijanis are bad people, and then that's reinforced on the political level by the kind of speeches that the presidents give, in which the president of Armenia says, Azerbaijan's been trying to destroy us. The president of So the president of Armenia says Azerbaijan's been trying to destroy us. The president of Azerbaijan says the Armenians are occupying our land. So this becomes a kind of national discourse, a national narrative about hating the other side. So it's whipped up. You see this all over the world. You see it in Cyprus. You see it in Ireland. You see it in India and Pakistan. But it becomes a whole kind of national identity thing in which Armenia is anti-Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan is anti-Armenia. But I think that's not where it started. It didn't start because people decided one fine day to hate Armenians or hate Azerbaijan. It started because they were disputing this territory, and the hatred came afterwards. Well, Azerbaijan for the last 23 years has been basically governed by father and son. The father was Haydar Aliyev. He was a KGB general. He was a senior figure in the government of the Soviet Union. He was a very powerful character, a very strong leader. He was more than 20 years. He was leader of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan, and then he came back as president of Azerbaijan. And he was a pretty tough guy. He could destroy his enemies if he wanted to. He was also quite popular in Azerbaijan. He was, I guess, the guy that most Azerbaijanis felt built them a state. But when he died in 2003, his son took over. His son Ilham Aliyev, who was quite young, really didn't have much experience, and basically his only qualification to be the next president was that he was the son of the father. And Ilham Aliyev has been leader of Azerbaijan now for 12 years, and shows no sign of stopping. And the kind of ironic thing is that the son, who is younger, who speaks English, who's worked in business, is actually turned out to be more authoritarian than the father. The father, he was a pretty strong guy, but he governed with a fairly light touch at times. And last few years we've seen the son consolidating his power. I think this speaks to a kind of paranoia on his part, and locking up a lot of the pro-Western figures, journalists, lawyers, human rights workers in Azerbaijan. And some of those people have been locked up, accused of collaborating with Armenia, which is obviously a really bad sign. This is a sign that basically the president of Azerbaijan is basically sending the message, there's only one person who can talk to the Armenians, and that's me. Anyone else who does it, I can accuse of being a traitor. So this is a really bad situation. And Azerbaijan's basically got now the worst Azerbaijan's basically got the worst human rights record of anywhere in Europe or that former Soviet space inside Europe. Journalist Hadija Ismailova is obviously one instance, but I could name 10 or 20 people who are sitting in jail just basically because of what they believe and what they stood up for. Azerbaijan's a really serious situation now. Ever since the mid-2000s, when Azerbaijan struck oil in a big way and started exporting it to the West, their budgets have increased massively. They now have a military budget officially of about $3 or $4 billion a year, on which they've been using to buy weapons. Now, the Azerbaijanis say this is the Ronald Reagan principle with the USSR. We're trying to force the Armenians to. We don't actually want a war. We just want to have a better situation, a better position at the negotiating table. We have a military build-up, and we force them to negotiate on our terms because we're threatening them. But on the ground, you've got artillery, you've got you've got these attack aircraft, you've got drones, you've got all sorts of heavy weaponry now. So back when the war ended in 1994, this was basically a bit of a quiet zone. A few soldiers carrying a few rifles, maybe machine guns over their shoulders. It wasn't that threatening. This has become much more high tech. You've got still a very small area with these very, very sophisticated weapons. And obviously the danger is that one day Azerbaijan will try to reconquer the land it lost in the 1990s, pull the trigger and you've got a major war on your hands. That would be pretty stupid it would be pretty stupid for the Azerbaijanis to start something. It would be pretty stupid for the Armenians to get themselves into a new war. I don't think either side particularly wants it. But wars are stupid things, and people can but anyway, officially of the de jure legally recognized territory. So yes, basically the Soviet Union ended, and basically there were all these territorial disputes, but the international community recognized all these new states as within their Soviet borders, which means that officially Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan. No Azerbaijani has lived there for 25 years. All the place names are Armenian. There's the Armenian army sitting there, but officially the world still regards it as part of Azerbaijan. So this is the strong card that Azerbaijan can play at the UN and other places, saying Armenia's occupying our land, and if we're building up military force, it's because we have a right to reconquer our land. There's also, of course, all the territory outside Karabakh, which was part of Azerbaijan. Armenians weren't particularly living there before the war. It was basically Azerbaijani land, which got conquered by the Armenians as a kind of buffer zone during the conflict. And the Armenians still hold that territory. Most of it is in ruins, most of it's empty. But hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis were living there up until the early 1990s. So yeah, Azerbaijan has a point that a lot of its territory is under occupation, and it certainly has a right to recover those lands outside Karabakh, which the Armenians didn't have any claim to back in the 1980s and 1990s. And so you've got this collision between Azerbaijan's claims in the UN and whatever, and the fact that the Armenians hold the territory, and also the third factor being that no one wants a new war internationally. So this is why this conflict doesn't get resolved. The Azerbaijanis have a legal case. The Armenians won the war and possess the facts on the ground, and the international community doesn't want a new conflict. And yeah, at the root of this is a conflict over a territory and who this territory belongs to. But then it's obviously become more than that. It's become a clash of identities between two people, between two nations. It's become a competition between two states in the world and with each other. And obviously on one side you have Armenians who are Christians, on the other side you have Azerbaijanis who are Muslims. But that's not to say that it's about Christianity and Islam. If you look at the fact that next door you've got Georgia. Georgia's a Christian nation, and Azerbaijanis and Georgians get along absolutely fine. In fact, they've got a couple of pipelines running between them. So it's not the fact that Georgians are Christians doesn't interfere with the good relationship between those two countries, Azerbaijan and Georgia. Likewise, Armenia has a pretty good relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So clearly, it's one thing that divides Armenians and Azerbaijanis, that in terms of their two different identities, this religious divide, but I wouldn't say it's at the root of the conflict. Well, this conflict is a big tragedy. It's a big tragedy for the people who got killed. It's a big tragedy for the people who lost their homes and are living elsewhere and scattered around the world. And it's a tragedy for the two countries because they can't develop properly. Railway lines are closed, borders are closed, money is spent on weapons, which should be spent on schools and hospitals. The whole thing is a big mess, an international mess. And sooner or later, they've got to sort it out. They've got to come to a deal. And suddenly the region's got to open up again. Borders have got to reopen. But for that to happen, there's got to be a bit of a psychological shift in which the two countries decide that they want to work together on this and not just fight each other in perpetuity. And unfortunately, that moment hasn't arrived. And everyone's still, I think it's 25 years ago, but everyone's still living with the conflict, with the blood that was spilt. So it may take another generation for that realization to come. And I think the other problem is that internationally it's not a big issue. Quite a lot of effort was spent on it in the 1990s, the early 2000s, to make a deal. Um, and then people got pretty tired. The negotiators, if you're Secretary of State Kerry or whatever, you're not going to say this is how I want to spend my this week working on this issue when I've got 10 other issues from, you know, Iran and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria to deal with. So, not surprisingly, it gets pushed down to just a kind of the mid-level. They manage the conflict. They try and keep the ceasefire, but they're not going to invest a lot of effort in trying to get a peace settlement between two peoples who don't seem to want one. As they say, you can't want it more than the people themselves. Well, I guess it means that people they just get on with their lives. If you're living in Karabakh, you're not recognized internationally, but you just can build something there. I first went to Karabakh in 1996, and the place was a mess. It was still full of ruins. There was, basically no economy, and now it's quite impressive. It's been rebuilt. I wouldn't say it looks amazing, but it looks pretty much like anywhere else in the region. They've managed to pull it up. So you just get on with your life. Azerbaijan has also turned around. They've had this big oil boom. They may be on the downturn now, but they've certainly built a lot again in the last 10, 15 years. So I guess life goes on. I think just that the priority has to be to prevent a new conflict, because basically we all know how much can be destroyed. You could destroy in a week what's been built in 20 years. This conflict has become a kind of central piece of the identity of what it means to be Armenia or what it means to be Azerbaijan. And they're both kind of locked in it together. They're kind of both imprisoned in this conflict. They achieved independence through this conflict, around this conflict, fighting this conflict. And so it's become inseparable from the national identity. So this heroic victory, which the Armenians won, and the suffering of the Armenian people on one side, and then the loss of territory and the terrible defeat and the betrayal, as Azerbaijanis see it, on the other side. And this sits pretty deep, and it's taught in schools, and it's commemorated at national holidays, and it's very hard to move on from. I think the only thing that resolves this situation is a new generation. I think the people who fled are basically, most of them are scarred for life. A lot of them find it very difficult to adapt to a new situation. Baku was a big urban environment, a big city where people were professionals, and then a lot of them got displaced, moved out, lost everything, and ended up sometimes in the countryside in the middle of nowhere. Some of them moved to places like Moscow. Some of them are in the United States. Some of them have done fine. I think it's really the next generation which is the one that can start again with a more kind of putting their best foot forward and facing the future. But I think it's a terrible condition to be a refugee and to lose everything and have to start your life basically from zero. And that's, and then in a poor country like Armenia, where there's no resources, where some of them didn't even speak the language properly, they tended to speak Russian in Baku rather than Armenian. So, it's a pretty sad story, yeah.